have held me in your arms, in my head. I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my head.
Hello, I'm Nessa O'Mahony, and you are very welcome to Volume 2, Season 1, Episode 1 of the Attic Sessions. So if you think we've been watching a lot of box sets since we saw you last, we have. But it's great to be back. We're still in the attic. Regrettably, because of the little health crisis that we're all in right now, we can't have anybody else in the attic apart from ourselves. But we've discovered, like everybody, that Zoom is a good substitute or the next best thing. So we are trying to resume our attic sessions via Zoom until that time when we can all be together again. And we are thrilled this morning that we have as our first Zoom interviewee Mr. John O'Donoghue, a very good old friend of us and the Attic Sessions, and looking resplendent, John, in your cocoon safeness of Brighton. So you're very welcome. Good to see you.
See you, Nessa.
And I'll just tell you a little about John before we have a conversation. He was born in London in 1958, I believe.
Indeed.
To Irish parents, hailing from Kerry and Monaghan, and has had a breathtaking career in the last 10 years, having probably worked very hard for 20 or 30 years before that, an overnight success after about 30 years of writing. And he has published a very well-received memoir called Sectioned, and his most recent collection of short stories, The King from Over the Water, recently got a really good review in the Irish Times. So we're going to talk about everything that got you here, John, to that sofa in Brighton. So tell me about the start. Tell me about growing up in London to Irish parents. Did you feel like you were an Irish lad living in London, or what was that kind of relationship between where you were living and where your parents had come from?
Well, my father was part of the post-war brawn drain. He came over to work on the buildings. So I think what he impressed upon me was that we'd come to a land of Banya Oga Shukra, a land of milk and sugar. We were different. We were, first of all, from when I was born, from a father who was part of the Kerry Gaeltacht. But he only left me those few words, Banya Orga Shukra. That's all he ever spoke in my presence. My mother said that whenever he lost his temper with her, he used to curse her in Irish, but by the time I came along, that had all gone. He was monoglot by then. He was English speaking. I don't know if he thought he'd turned his back on the country, because he never really went back. He only went back something before he died.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to have an Irish accent at home, well up until the age of 14 at least. I used to talk to my parents in an Irish accent, and as soon as my London friends would come to the door, it'd be, "What, Joe, how you going?" So this kind of hybridity within me was not something I thought twice about, really, to tell you the truth. My mother and I used to go over to Ireland every year to Monaghan, to her people, and I think that reinforced the sense of Irishness.
Mm.
So growing up with them, we were very close, but it was unspoken, the Irish identity. I was a Catholic family. We'd go to Mass. My mother would take me on a Sunday for a ceilidh, she called it, see the relatives over in East Ham. We had Monaghan relatives living over there. So certain Irish traditions, I suppose, certain Irish ways of going on were kept up.
Mm-hmm.
But it took me a long while to figure out afterwards what exactly my identity was.
Mm.
And that identity was London Irish. So
and I'd imagine that. Well, I wonder whether language and how you use language, and whether people would react to how you use language, might have been coming into your consciousness as a writer. Because I'm thinking about Evan Boland's famous poem In the Classroom, where she uses the I amn't terminology that so many Irish people do. And we think that's a perfectly normal thing. And then somebody English says amn't. What do you mean amn't? So the stuff that you're assuming is absolutely the current lingua franca, you get challenged on it, and that makes you think about how you use language. Were you kind of noticing phrases, or were you able to switch very readily from one argot into another?
Not immediately. I remember going to the first primary school I went to, St Joseph's in Hackney. We were living in Hackney before we moved to Leighton. And I remember saying to one of the boys that I was washing my hair tonight, and I gave it an Irish pronunciation, and immediately the cry went up, "You hair? What's your hair? You're talking about your hair. You're washing your hair, mate." You know. So the code switching would have, I suppose, started from then. I became, although going to a Catholic school in London, there were other Irish lads around me, or
Yeah.
second generation Irish lads. You know, I can remember going to school with Kevin Fitzgerald, Michael Howard, Terry Messenger. These were all lads from second generation backgrounds as well.
Yeah.
Perhaps they'd had to mask it. Perhaps there was still a sense of dominance amongst the Cockneys, the East Londoners. And we had to subsume ourselves to blend in. I think.
And what about what you were reading at the time, or were you a reader?
Oh yeah. Oh no, my mother started me off on that very early. She got me reading and writing preschool. You know, just went to the library and getting the books that would be part and parcel of any kids of about 4 or 5's education then.
Yeah.
But by the time I was starting to get beyond Janet and John, I think Just William.
Yes. We were a big Just William household, actually. My brother, having 2 older brothers. Richmond Crompton, wasn't it?
Richmond Crompton, yes. I was rereading, would you believe, one of, well, the first story in this. I got this kind of 10-volume collection of William stories, and in one of the stories, one of the first stories in it, the father is impressed by William's eloquence. So Richmond Crompton's writing at a level where, if parents were reading to their boys or their girls, there'd be something in it for the parents, because that would have been over my head when I was reading Richmond Crompton. You know, no, the actual phrase was dreaded his eloquence. Parent dreaded his eloquence, and I could well identify with that. Having been in the classroom, there's quite a few characters in my time whose eloquence I came to dread.
And what about Irish writers?
Well, I'm trying to fathom that. I think I started to become aware of Irish writing, would you believe, as corny as it sounds, through Ireland's Own. I think we used to get the odd copy of Ireland's Own, and I think that's where me kind of tapping into Irish literature started. But I think that really started happening when I would have been about 14, 15. I can remember, I don't know how I'd heard about James Joyce. I hadn't read a word of James Joyce, but I can remember in the library at my secondary school asking the head of English, was there any Joyce in the library? Knowing that it would be a name, wherever I pick this up, that would impress the English master.
He didn't think it was Joyce Carey by any chance, did he?
Pardon?
He didn't think it was Joyce Carey.
No, he knew what I was on about. But I think Joyce would have been one of the first Irish writers I would have read. I think Dubliners, chamber music.
Yeah,
I started there. I started up the shallow end of Joyce,
yeah.
and I eventually swum up to the deeper depths of Ulysses as my education progressed.
And reading that, because I'm curious about how this kind of, identification with a place that you weren't born in, but it was, very much contributing to
Yeah,
your culture.
yeah,
So I read Ulysses as a Dubliner who kind of makes connections between the places that were being described and how
yeah,
I see them now.
yeah.
As a London Irish lad reading Ulysses, what was your reaction to the place? Was like Dublin this kind of mythical figure, or was it the place that you got off the boat and went up to Monaghan from, or how did the versions, the literary version and your experience of it chime, I suppose?
Well, we used to get off the boat right enough. It was pre-Ryanair days. We'd be getting off the boat, but my mother would often take a stopover in Dublin. Take a stopover. So Cleary's was familiar to me, the General Post Office. I can remember getting a suit in Cleary's. I can remember a lot of things I couldn't get in Dublin. I couldn't get Swiss trainers. I couldn't get pairs of jeans. My
Gee,
mother, oh
couldn't get
yes,
jeans, not until the late 90s, John.
oh no, it was like Soviet Russia or something. Why couldn't I have these jeans? My mother kept a tight hand on the purse strings there, but I had that fleeting familiarity with Dublin.
Yeah.
What really changed things was after my parents died. My father died when I was 14. My mother died when I was 19. And I think that Irishness became something I wanted to excavate a little more closely
Yeah.
because of the sense of loss. So there was a writers group in London called Green Ink, and there's a few other writers who come out of there: Deirdre Shanahan, Peter Woods, myself, and I used to go along to see them. That would have been sort of like the mid-80s. I started, I think,
Hmm.
and they would meet in the Camden Irish Centre, and then also in Marchway had a bookshop. Ken Livingstone gave them a bookshop eventually.
Dermot Healy didn't turn up there, did he?
No, no, not
Because he
Dorothy.
did. He was in London in that period, wasn't he?
There's a good few country folk over there then.
Yeah.
I think that was a high time for Irish immigration then.
Yeah, I mean, 1984, when I left university, I think I was one of the only people in my year that didn't go abroad, and London was the main place.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
No, I got a great sense of, well, it became a point of, like everything with the Irish, it became a point of comedy almost because there was talk then of the professional Irish person in London. Because the previous wave, my father's generation, the kind of the agencies, the welfare that was there to meet the Irish coming over was provided by the church. And of course, there was the dance halls, and I think the Irish Centre in Camden was just getting going from that wave of immigration. But
mm,
that subsequent wave, in between the 80s wave and my parents' generation, I think there was a sort of 70s, late 70s wave that was more secular. And they set up advice agencies, they set up housing associations, they set up more centres, more Irish centres.
mm,
So I was able to plug into that a lot more. So I
yeah,
was able to go to pubs like the Queen Vic on the Holloway Road and take my Guinness with the navvies and stand at the end of the evening for the Irish national anthem. I can remember a young Asian fella been in there not knowing what was going on, and
yeah,
all the navvies telling him, get up, because he was still sat down when the Irish national anthem was playing, God love him. Uh, but then there was Green Ink Bookshop, there was the Roger Casement Irish Centre up round the top of the Holloway Road. There was new mappings, if you like, for the Irish.
but a lot
Uh,
of discomfort, I'm guessing, as well, because this would have been the period of the IRA bombings on the mainland.
yeah,
Um, So there must have been an ambivalence, or was there, about your sense
Oh,
of identity during that period?
oh well, the circles I moved in, I was lucky not to have to wind the neck in too much. Uh, and anyway, with an accent like this, most of the time I wasn't going to get any flack. I was very aware of two campaigns, the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six campaigns to free the men unjustly imprisoned. And as much as there was a cultural wing, shall we say, of the Irish in London, there was definitely a political wing. The Roger Casement Irish Centre actually paid host to Danny Morrison, I believe.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. And I always, whenever anyone in that community talked about the lads, my hackles actually used to rise a bit because I used to think, why are you giving credence or credibility to people doing these things? So my nationalism, if you like, such as it was a kind of old civic nationalism, and I was aware of the political overtures from the Labour Party. There were elements in the Labour Party that were very keen to get the Irish vote in London. I mean, Ken Livingstone, I think, was a man who was completely altruistic towards the Irish. He sort of got the Irish, but there was probably other elements around him that were a bit more entranced by the radical chic, what the provisionals were doing, and were kind of, I don't know, romantically revolutionary in their way. And I think they didn't see with clear eyes just kind of what was going on and how, you know, dark things were done in the name of the Irish that a lot of the Irish just didn't want to put up with at all. And
So
I'm definitely one of those.
the writing that you were doing yourself, but also that, you know, in those writers groups that you attended at the time, how much did people engage with that, with the politics, or was it just a topic that was avoided? People weren't writing.
No, I didn't see it, to tell you the truth. I didn't see it in Green Ink. Green Ink seemed to be completely clear of that. I think there may have been other writers, but who they were, I'd be hard put at this present moment to tell you who they were. I think it was there in the air. Let's put it like this: there was no Frank O'Connor writing Guest of the Nation for the provisionals that I was aware.
Or no Flaherty or yeah.
No, there's nothing like that.
So you mentioned Frank O'Connor, and you know, we're going to be talking about your short stories. What writer did you see yourself most in the tradition of then?
Well, when I went to university, I was very lucky after my rackety time on and off the psychiatric merry-go-round from about the.
Should we backtrack just for chronology's sake?
We will.
That rackety time was the subject of your incredibly successful memoir, Sectioned,
Yes.
which won the Mind Book of the Year in 2010. So what was that about? What period did that cover, and what happened to you, John?
What happened? Well, age 16, my father had died. I was getting bullied at school. I went from the Catholic school and the known contours to a large extent of the community I grew up in, multicultural Catholic community of Irish, Italians, Poles. And I decided that I wasn't going to go to the school that we went to. So I decided, age 14, to go to the state school. Back then we had this bifurcation, age 14. You went to the junior high school till you were 14, from 11 to 14, then you could go to the senior high school. And a lot of my friends went to George's, Cardinal Wiseman, I think it was then called, and I decided to go to Leighton Senior High. So I went there, and I perhaps struck an odd figure, by turns melancholy and by turns merry. but I think some other fellas picked up on kind of what was going on. I sort of, my father died, my mother became a bit unwell. She was pretty struck, really. She'd had a previous history of mental ill health herself. So I was asked by a social worker when I was 14, did I want to be fostered? So I weighed it up and I thought, well, if I'm fostered, I could go to a nice middle class family where I get help with the homework, get a good set of qualifications, and then swing back to my mother. And, you know, as a rising civil servant or something like that, a customs officer. We had a scoutmaster who was a customs officer. I thought, working with the customs, this sounds okay. So I said, okay, I'll be fostered. There was no case conference or anything like that. My mother was involved in this decision making. And of course, I had extended family in East Ham, and it would have been the modern way, I think, to have got us together and to have thought about this extended family in East Ham, and that would have kept me within the confines of the world I kind of knew a bit. But no, they decided to send me to, I've got to say, a very nice Cockney family in Woodford Green. Woodford Green is quite a posh part of London, but we were in a little council flat. So to some extent, it was one down from where we lived. We lived in the upper first story of a terraced house. We had our own sort of flat in a divided terraced house in Leighton. Anyway, so I got in with the Christian Union at the school I was involved in. And not to put too fine a point on it, Nessa, I was exorcised.
You were exorcised.
I was exorcised.
This
Yeah.
would be, yeah.
A rogue exorcism of this of latter years, and the Church of England, because it was the Church of England vicar who carried this out, had strict guidelines about candidates, shall we call them, exorcism, and so it was a very traumatic experience, and it made me, whatever melancholy subsisted within me, it completely flipped the lid, and I ended up psychotic after many sleepless, terrified nights following this. I think the poor foster parents just did not know what was going on at all. In fact, no one knew what was going on. Only the people who'd been in that room, and then when I was taken to this other room, and the vicar himself, and the people involved, only they knew what was going on, because for 4 months when I was in mental hospital, I couldn't tell anyone. It was too deep, the shame or the trauma of it or the madness of it. So eventually I was able to tell a social worker who befriended me in the hospital, Barbara, and I think from that point I started to make some progress towards discharge. I was 6 months altogether, 16 in Claybury, and then I got the taste for it. I got institutionalised a long time. It would be it'd be a very rare case these days in England where somebody would be months in a mental hospital.
So did you feel safer there, John?
Yeah. It wasn't something I consciously articulated. It was at an emotional level.
Yeah.
But there was a big feeling of security there. I don't know whether there wasn't a feeling of security outside the hospital. I mean, the foster parents were perfectly me.
But there's something about expertise. I mean, on a sort of a different level, I noticed it in my father's last years in and out of St. James's Hospital. He felt safe when he was in because the doctors knew what they were doing.
I suppose there must be something like that to it, Nessa. Yeah.
And so this was a period of what, 5 or 6 years?
Oh no, God, I was well, 12 really, all told. Because what happened was, as much as I'd been abused, I suppose, by this vicar, another figure came along who abused me terribly, and that was Mrs. Thatcher. Because I left the foster home when I was 19. My education was put back a little bit. I managed to leave home, as it were, with 3 O levels and an elementary swimming certificate. With a plan to do well at school and get the civil servant's job and look after my mother. That completely collapsed well, because my mother died when I was in foster care still. That was that was when I was about 19, and then shortly after I had to leave home. Luckily, leaving home, I fell on my feet. I got a job in Ryman's in Brewer Street, the stationers. And the chap I was colleague there, he was looking for accommodation as well as I was. My parents put me up for a few weeks when I was working there, and then I got a place in Hampstead with him. But we were a bit of the odd couple because he'd been to an independent school and could make 3 sheets last a fortnight. I managed to make 2 sheets last 6 weeks, you know. So I had very little house training. I had very little preparation for the world beyond foster care and everything, you know. And and I, you know, while I was in the hospital, I was in the hospital when I was 16, and then I went back when I was 17. Had a little kind of relapse, I suppose, but I wasn't in as long then. But then they diagnosed me with bipolar, and I definitely did have the bipolar. There was a bit of comorbidity with it because I think it often happens hyperactive thyroid. So I would be high from the hypomania, and I'd be high. It would be sort of intensified by the overactive thyroid.
Yeah.
I can remember being in the hospital having to run around it 3 times, and funny enough, me and 2 other fellas, the same thing was happening. We were all so high, we had to get up in the morning before anything and run around the hospital before we could face the day. Excess energy.
So say from the age of 14 to the age of 26.
28.
28.
Yeah. 16 was when I was in hospital.
Yeah.
14 was when things started to fall apart a bit.
Yeah. So we were hoping that you might now. Mind It got written, I suppose, 2 decades later, really, didn't it?
Did.
You were going to read maybe a short section from it?
I will, Nessa. Now, the thing about Playbury was a big old Victorian asylum, and you know, treatment was open-ended, but there were some odd occurrences happened there when I was a patient about one of them. So I'll just read this short extract. She is having the bit with him. An Indian woman is standing in front of Dr. Popper, accusing her of having an affair with a doctor who is blushing, sitting a few chairs down from her. Neither is responding. We are having group therapy. The group is very large. O1 is closed for redecorating, and O1 and O2 have been combined. There are about 40 patients altogether from the 2 walls. Therapy is becoming more like a mad cabaret turn. There are just too many patients to properly focus on. Only a stunning performance is going to get any attention. We're all sat round the walls of the large day room. The size of the group says something about the hospital. It seems to be collapsing in on itself, like us. The Indian woman is manic. Used to be one of their own, a psychiatrist, privy to secrets, theirs and ours. Everyone is appalled, and amused. The woman is suffering, but that doesn't stop her embarrassing the most powerful figures in our lives. He is having the bit. The 2 doctors sit in stony silence. Dr. Popper looks strained. Summer air shimmers in the room, dispelling the thick institutional dust from the choking carpets. The scented breeze stirs memories of outside, the freedom of escape. But we're afraid of that world. Playbury, like all institutions, kind of Neverland. Here, adulthood and responsibility are postponed by the routines of meal times, medication, eating hours, and occupational therapy. The Indian doctor can go as far as she likes in her ramblings. Her allegations are not what's embarrassing Dr. Popper. These are a symptom of her illness, a projection of her speeding, deluded mind. No, it's the fact that a mad shrink is worse than a bent copper. This woman's madness is a sign that even our doctors are mortal, like us, can crack and go crazy. She's very disturbing for all of us.
Absolutely. Now, when you published that, is it fair to say that the literature around mental health was still fairly sparse? Would that be a sort of a fair comment?
I think there'd been the rise in something that I think was an interesting literary phenomena, and dates back to the advent of Thatcherism and the advent of Reaganism, and that's what we find upon it what was so glibly called in publishing circles the misery memoir.
Mm.
So David Peltzer and
Angela's Ashes.
a whole rake of other authors, some who went to greater glory, some who rested on what might be called the mid-list or even worse. And it seemed to me that this generation coincided with these two political figures. I came of age just as Mrs. Thatcher was being elected. Excuse me. So I think there was that literature. I think straightforward memoirs of experiences in psychiatric hospital, I think they're a bit rarer. And maybe that's what made mine stand out a little bit.
Well, apart from the quality of the writing, which is intense and very humane, like there's no sense of judgment.
No, I was very particular about two things when I was writing it, Nessa. One was I can remember my agent or one of the senior agents in the agency saying that there's a moment where I meet the Catholic chaplain in Maybury, who was a lovely man actually, and he was an older fella, and he told me that in the 30s, patients used to farm the land in Maybury, and that he had this groove in his upper lip, and it wasn't a hair lip at all. It was a patient had sliced it with a razor, and senior agent said, "Say that it was cut well deep." Well, I don't really use those kind of.
Mm.
Most particular to like almost like Beckett says, song steel. I didn't want my vocabulary to be a marker of where I'd come from, or even at the other end, the education I'd get. So I tried to keep it a very scrupulous, a mean style. And I didn't do the Brian Dean thing. I ended up in Pentonville prison when I was unwell, so I didn't call the prison officers screws, as he does in Borstal Boy. They were going to be prison officers.
Mm.
And I wasn't in a DOS house, I was in a hostel for homeless men. So I very much wanted this kind of non-judgmental.
But also stripping away the mythology of
Yes.
it, really.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I wasn't Randall P. McMurphy. My agents, when the publicity for the book, or sorry, the publishers book, when that was being sent out, they like to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's a different book altogether because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is solely situated in the asylum, whereas this book, I wasn't in there all the time.
Mm.
I was in and out.
Yeah.
So I bumped along the bottom of Mrs. Thatcher's Britain, and I saw, I experienced long-term unemployment, homelessness, and all the depredations that were visited upon a whole class of people who really never had a voice, I don't think.
Mm.
One of the few who's been able to bear witness to what occurred. We've been kind of forgotten about, and we've been subsumed into something else called the underclass, which is kind of got a very pejorative tone to it. It's almost Nazi, a whole group of people in underclass. But that's kind of what it was like.
So when that book published, I mean, it did change your life in the sense that you'd been working very hard behind the scenes, like most of us, and then suddenly here was this incredible success, this award-winning book. You had an agent, for God's sake. So, what did that feel like?
It felt like a vindication, really. I mean, Blake Morrison picked up on a thing about the book. He said poetry kept me going from the age my father died. Really, I started trying to write. I discovered Dylan Thomas in his notebooks, and this seemed fantastic. And of course, those notebooks of Dylan Thomas. A fifth one has been recently discovered. I'm dying to. They are an adolescent's dream because they chart this kind of interiority of Thomas in a lot of these poems. So I kept, but I got to the age of about 21 and I ripped them all up because I didn't want to be looking over my shoulder as he did. And then, having taken on a bit of an apprenticeship in these notebooks, I then got into green ink. And then shortly after that, I got into university. And at university, I went to the library, and that's where I read Frank O'Connor. I then apprenticed myself to try and find out how he did it. I'd heard he was good. I read one or two stories. I obviously read Guest of the Nation at that point. I got out his collected stories, and I tried to go through them all, as many as I could, try and see what he did. Later on, I read The Lonely Voice, because his lectures he gave in America about the short story.
Yeah.
So I've been working away. I've been working away at various other little things. I was involved in a literary magazine at university, and after university, it continued.
You were in East Anglia as an undergrad, weren't you?
Where you went yourself, Nessa?
As a postgrad, John.
Postgrad, or got postgrad. So I'm doing the PhD. Yes. So UEA marked a big turning point for me. Getting in there with my 3 O-levels and elementary student certificate. One of their mottos is "do different," and they certainly did different, taking me on. I was still a little bit wild, and of course I came up against a lot of people. There was a 60% public school intake at UEA the year I went there. I managed to find the boys who were a little bit like me, but I also brushed up against some people who went on to very illustrious careers, and I think I chafed them a little bit. I think I was up for giving some of them a bit of a hard time.
So you were sort of maintaining several strands, because you were writing poetry, you were writing, you had the memoir, and now you're publishing short stories, and have set up a press specifically for the publication of. Is it fiction particularly, or
what I've tried to think about, Nessa, is I've tried to think about several strands to it, several corners, if you like.
So called the Wild Geese Press.
The Wild Geese Press, books from the Irish diaspora. You know, the wild geese left Ireland and went mainly to the courts of Europe, where they were all generals. They were the wave of Irish aristocrats who had to fold up their tents and camp abroad once they'd been defeated.
Just by complete coincidence, Mary O'Donnell posted on Facebook today that apparently there's an excavation of Hugh O'Donnell's grave in Spain.
Good Lord.
There you go.
Marvellous. Anyway, well, so the Wild Geese Press. Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to publish several sorts of books. We want to publish contemporary books. So they'd be fiction, poetry, memoir, or shall we say non-fiction. Then we wish to publish out of copyright classics. There's a book by a Kerryman called John Sweeney, who went on to be a detective in Scotland Yard. And he's written a memoir about this way back in Victorian, early 20th century. And he was on the detail that looked after Queen Victoria when she went over to Ireland.
Wow.
So I want to get hold of that book and republish it and write an introduction to it and all of this. I'd love Ken Bruin to write the introduction to it. In fact, if this comes Ken Bruin's way and he's up for it, get in touch.
Hey, Ken. Love your work.
Love your work, Ken. Yeah. So out of copyright classics, we want to do monographs, and particularly after MA dissertations. I think poor old MA students hardly get a look in academia. They kind of this odd in between creature that no longer an undergraduate, but not quite the full shilling as an academic. They often do great work with their dissertations. So I'd like to get hold of them. And anthologies. One of the books we published, starting off, yes, we did my short stories, but we also published I Wouldn't Start From Here, The Second Generation Irish in Britain, an anthology of essays, stories and poems. We believe it's the first work by specifically second generation Irish writers. So if you like, it was green ink where I went way back in Ken Livingstone's London. It was green ink by other means, if you like, a continuation.
And
Continuity greening.
are those writers that you encountered in the 80s still around? Are they still writing?
Some of them are, as I say. Deirdre Shanahan is quite a prolific story writer, at least. I never met Deirdre. I see her on Twitter, and I kind of cyber stalk her, if you like, just to see what she's up to. But I know other people in Green Ink who really reckoned her work back then, and she's gone on to great glory. Peter Woods, who I don't know if you know, Peter Woods went on to take on the Prince of Wales pub in Kentish Town and run it very successfully. He said one of the things he did was all the Irish musicians would be coming to play the weekends in the bigger pubs. So he'd nab them for the midweek, wouldn't be doing anything at all. So he went on to write a book called The Living Note with another Irish musician, kind of composite family of Irish musicians. Quite a lavish, almost coffee table kind of book. It's the kind of group biography of a fictional Irish group of musicians. He's lavishly illustrated it, and he went on to write a novel as well, and then did an RTE radio before her in, and he's done some brilliant documentaries. One of the documentaries he produced was because it was called The Man in the Moon is from Carrickmacross, about a man from Carrickmacross, dear old Monaghan, who went over to America and worked on the Lockheed program and was involved in the moonshot. Plaque on the moon with all the names of the people who worked on the moonshot. And apparently this man's name is on the plaque.
And so it's Moonahan, really, rather than
Moonahan. I love that.
And it brings us nicely to your current book, The King from Over the Water, because if I'm right in remembering this, a lot of it is set in Monaghan because you're a protagonist, you're fictional protagonist, and they're linked short stories, aren't they?
They are.
Goes home, goes to the family back in Monaghan during the summer holidays. Yes. So tell us about those stories and how they came to be.
Well, there's those four bears who stand behind me. So there's Frank O'Connor and Sean O'Phelan. I went on to a bit of a study of O'Phelan as well. There's also Portrait of the Arts' Young Dog by Dylan Thomas, and of course the Just William stories. I come over as an only child from London to romp around the fields of Monaghan with my 6 Monaghan cousins. And I did that Dylan Thomas thing where I use my own kind of name. We had an elder cousin, Johnny. So to distinguish me from Johnny, I was John Kevin, my baptismal name, Kevin. So to this day, I'm known by my cousins as John Kevin or JK or whatever, And so I used their real names, but I disguised the place they're from. I called it Ballydawn. It's actually Ballinode. They won't mind me saying they've dispersed from Ballinode these days. But Ballinode was where we went. In fact, one of my cousins now lives in another village in Monaghan, and she said she moved there because it was the closest she could get to Ballinode in the 60s. And my other cousin Matt said once when we were reminiscing, he said we had a special childhood. And I was really chuffed that he said he included me in that childhood. So us coming over. And the thing about the summers was my mother would take me out early from school. So we get 6 weeks in England. Of course, the Irish school holidays were a lot longer. And I, at one point, went to school with my cousins. I've got a little story about it, but I don't cover myself with glory in the school at all. Mainly because the Irish scholars around me are much better educated. The question asked me was, how many pennies are there in 6 shillings? And I didn't know. Well, I got hissed the answer from behind, and then trouble erupted. But anyway, so they were idyllic summers, and I wanted to recapture those in these lightly fictionalized. As I say lightly, David Mitchell was once asked how much of his stories are autobiographical. He said 38.6%. It was a brilliant answer. It's sort of, a ludicrous answer to a ludicrous question.
Spurious accuracy is the phrase that was once used to me about something. So I think that's spurious accuracy. Do you want to read a little bit from one of them?
I will. The story's called Dust to Dust, and it's about a requiem mass. What's happened is my mother's uncle in New York died, and he's a single man, and the church has only just allowed cremation of Catholics. So Vatican II brought in cremation, and there's been a bit of a mix-up, as you'll discover as I read towards the end of this. Give me the ashes. I jumped a foot. Why did Father Casey want Uncle Seamus's ashes? Surely there was a good bit of the mass still to go. Come on, you young pup, what are you waiting for? Father Casey's red-rimmed eyes were boring into me. He was not a man to be crossed, at 10 a.m. on a dreary midweek morning, in the horrors of fire and brimstone. I stepped out from the choir stall and advanced to the altar, picked up the box containing Uncle Seamus's ashes, over to Father Casey, and handed them to him. He gave me a dirty look from his glassy eyes. I nodded reverently and returned to the choir stall. By now I was thoroughly puzzled. Couldn't Mass be entering the holy moments of prayer and transubstantiation I had witnessed countless times, knew almost backward from having served on the altar in England? I thought perhaps I'd missed something, that my daydreaming had led me to skipping great passages of this requiem. Uncle Seamus's farewell to the gleaming towers of downtown Manhattan, modern times in the future, Ballydawn and where he'd come from. Slowly the congregation approached the altar rail. Father Casey was there to greet them, a small metal vessel in his hands. As each parishioner approached him, come in the vessel and place the sign of the cross on their foreheads. My mother was the first to receive Father Casey's blessing, and she turned away. There on her forehead was a smear of ash. I knew now why the statues were veiled. This was Ash Wednesday, the start of Lent, and all the people processing up to receive the sign of the cross were being smudged with ashes from the box on the altar. Father Casey had decanted them into his little vessel and was signaling now for me to come up and top him up. The ashes were the wrong ashes. The ashes in the box were the remains of Uncle Seamus. They weren't the ashes for Ash Wednesday at all. What would I do? Couldn't stop the mass. Father Casey would excommunicate me. From the choir stall opposite, Matty was grinning like a cat, but I didn't think it was a laughing matter, not at all. Father Casey was looking very cross now. He must be running out, I realised, and there were still lots of people needing their ashes. I walked over to the altar, bowed, and picked up the box of Uncle Seamus's remains. The box of Father Casey used a little scoop to decant them into his vessel. I bowed and walked back to the choir stall. The priest continued applying Uncle Seamus's ashes to the foreheads of the mourners. I was powerless to stop him. Resigned now to Father Casey dispersing the last of Uncle Seamus's remains onto the foreheads of the congregation, and watched as they all walked solemnly back down the aisle. As the last of them returned to their pews, I looked out, each of them daubed with a grey star on their foreheads, and I thought then that at least Uncle Seamus was amongst his own. Up a prayer for him and his friend Mr. Lupelli, all who died so far from the land of earth.
I'm remembering my father's phrase, it could happen to a bishop. So wonderful job. How do people get hold of The King from Over the Water? There is a website for the Wild Geese Press?
There is, thewildgeesepress.com, and all the purchasing details are on that.
And we will put that link to that on our Attic Sessions homepage as well. So what's next for you, John? When, if we ever get out of this lockdown or not, what are your plans to do next?
Well, I found a little publisher who are going to bring out this novel of mine. The novel is harking back to those times we were talking about in Irish London of the 80s. It's a thriller set amongst the bourgeoisie of Irish London. So not the generation my father knew, but that sort of secular generation set up their Irish centres and welfare agencies and housing associations. So it's a little thriller, a little murder mystery, if you like. But to counterpoint the macho conventions of the thriller, I've got flashbacks to the famine voiced for an ancestress of the main character who converts for a bowl of soup, therefore is lost to the family. And then over the course of the next 5 novels, he makes this genealogical investigation to recover the lost family members.
So this is a whole sequence of novels.
Well, you know as well as me, Nessa, that the world's biggest library is the book I'm about to write. Fortunately, I have written this book and have finished it, and I'm working away on the next one.
Very
I
good.
have it all planned out.
So the
And
Netflix series is guaranteed.
I hope. We live in hope, Nessa. We live in hope.
We very much live in hope. Well, listen, it has been an absolute pleasure both to see you again, because it's been too long, but also to hear about the current work and the past work, and to just spend a bit of time in your company. We will, as I said, put details of Wild Geese Press and how you get sectioned, because that's certainly still in print and a wonderful read.
Don't get people sectioned, whatever you do. Don't get them sectioned, whatever you do. Nessa. We don't want people getting sectioned. Oh, we want them getting the book. Oh no, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
The book. Ideally, the book. Yeah, no. Let's not do anything that we could be sued for later. So listen, you take care of yourself. Great to chat to you. And I will just say to the viewers, lovely to be back, and hope you have enjoyed this. And we will try this again very soon.
That I'm just a dreamer, I dream, 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.